are the Ukrainian studies that we know of today, primarily in Northern America, still relevant for 2017? It would seem that that's a big question mark. It's really up to you to decide whether you think they are still relevant or they are not. Student numbers are falling and have been falling for at least a decade in traditional Ukrainian studies, which by that I mean areas such as Ukrainian language, culture, literature, and history. That's not true of all professors. When Professor Mogotchi has a class, it's very popular because that's his reputation. It's Toronto and elsewhere. But on the whole, and that's certainly true of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, at least until Sergei Plokhy arrived, the student numbers we are talking about for literature, culture, language were less than 5 in a typical class. Most academics wouldn't care because most academics don't really like teaching. My wife is a teacher, and the big difference between teachers and academics is that teachers see their job as a vocation. They love teaching. They really enjoy the energy in the classroom. Academics do not. If they could go without teaching, they would. And hence they don't chase student numbers when student numbers are declining. And particularly when, as is the downside of a tenured system you have in North America, you don't lose your job if your student numbers go down. Very different to the private sector in that sense. The 3 areas where Ukrainian studies are really absent and have been absent for a long time, at least since the 1990s, the reasons for that are different in all 3 cases. But let's look at the first one, an area I'm not really an expert on, and that is Canadian-Ukrainian history and Canadian-Ukrainian studies. At the 40th anniversary of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies held in Edmonton recently, the first director of KIUS, the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, Professor Lupul, complained that those that came after him, primarily those who came in the 1990s and since, have not really taken an interest in promoting and putting research and funding into Canadian Ukrainian studies. Professor Lupul blamed this on the fact that Americans had moved into Canada in the 80s and later and taken up a huge number of the jobs in Ukrainian studies. Mogotchi, Subtelny, Tarnowski, Kohut, Sissin, these are all American Ukrainians who came to Canada and got very good positions. Obviously, every academic is subjective in the field or fields that they would like to invest research, money, time, and energy. And if you're not Canadian, you're less likely to be interested in putting research, time, and energy into Canadian Ukrainian studies. That was the argument made by Professor Lupul. And certainly if we look at the directors of CIUS since it was founded, the first 2, Professor Lupul and Professor Kravchenko, who are Canadian Ukrainians, are very different to the ones who came subsequently, Professor Kohut, Sissin, and more recently to this day, Professor Kravchenko from Ukraine. So we have 2 Canadians and then 3 non-Canadians who have led that. And the decline, I'm sure, in Canadian Ukrainian studies has been from the 1990s. This is an area, by the way, where Canadian Ukrainians could actually change the situation. All of these professors are retired or past their retirement age and therefore will be retiring in the very near future. And therefore these positions would more likely, the positions that could become open will more likely go to Canadians, people from the Canadian Ukraine community primarily. Today, unlike in the sort of 70s, 80s, there is more legal requirements for universities to hire first their own citizens, and if they can't be found to fill those positions, then they look elsewhere. That is usually what one reads on the application forms. So Canadian Ukrainians could be here in a position to actually take over the positions that were taken by Americans back 20 to 30 years ago. So Canadian Ukrainian studies could receive a lift once the American Ukrainians who took over Ukrainian studies become retired or go into retirement. The second area is an area I'm more interested in my field, and that's the area of Ukrainian nationalism. It's rather strange that North America was this driving force in research and publishing in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and then from the 90s it just went. To give you some examples of books, John Armstrong's book on Ukrainian nationalism came out a long time ago in the sort of 50s, I believe, and maybe 60s, was reprinted in 1980. Alexander Mottle's book, The Turn to the Right, came out in the same year, in 1980. And then CIUS did some very good stuff. They had this conference collection by Yuri Bozic, which was kind of a counter to the Deschênes Commission, which was then investigating alleged war crimes committed by Ukrainians in World War II. This came out in the mid-80s. And then this great collection of translations of Ukrainian nationalist underground thought, which came out at the same time, mid-1980s. So we're talking about a period when particularly Bogdan Kravchenko was the director of CIUS. And then from 1990s, nothing. So why is that? Well, there could be many reasons. One of them could be that Ukraine became an independent state. There was no real further attacks by the Wiesenthal Center, for example, on Ukrainian nationalism. It was assumed that this was now a finished issue. It's no longer an issue for the Ukrainian diaspora maybe to put funding in. It also coincided with the change in leadership in CIUS at the time, when Bogdan Kravchenko moved to Ukraine to work, and Professor Kohut and Professor Sissin took over CIUS. But it is also the case that big emigre organizations, such as the Stepan Bandera wing of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, never really were interested in putting resources, and they have resources from Kreditivki and elsewhere, into research programs on Ukrainian nationalism. They weren't interested in that in the US or in Canada. And so there was no evolution, no coming to prominence of new, more younger versions of Armstrong. I mean, Armstrong's book today could be a great work to be updated with all the new archives that have appeared on Ukrainian nationalism. It's now pretty dated, and it's good for its time, but it's now pretty dated. Certainly, material appeared in Ukrainian. Professor Petro Potichny has continued to edit Letopis Upa with the support of different parts of the Ukrainian community, but in English, it's pretty barren. And so, therefore, we were not prepared with the return to attacks on Ukrainian nationalism, which began, by the way, in the Orange Revolution over a decade ago, but of course have been picked up in the last few years by the Putin regime, which again have been picked up by sort of left-wing academics and journalists in the West. These attacks on Ukrainian nationalism, Ukrainian fascism, etc., Ukrainian anti-Semitism, have not been responded to because there aren't the experts who have been trained, who have been doing research programs and publishing in Ukrainian nationalism in the last 20 years. So we have a huge number of people who I would call revisionists, such as John Paul Himka, University of Alberta, who are continually writing attacks, both polemical in the media and in academic publications on Ukraine nationalism, Ukraine anti-Semites, etc. So, and some occasions echoing what's coming out of Moscow, but there's no real response from the Ukraine diaspora. There's only really two people who have been publishing kind of counterfactual arguments. That's Alexander Motyl from Rutgers University and Miroslav Shkandrey, who just published a very good long study of Ukrainian nationalism at the University of Manitoba. But that's it. It's a very small number of people. And that is, again, a major gap in the research and publishing programs of Ukrainian studies. It's mirrored by the fact that in Ukraine, the academic profession is publishing a lot on Ukrainian nationalism, on the ideology of Ukrainian nationalism, what happened in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. But unfortunately, most Ukrainian academics don't know English. Therefore, they don't read Western publications. Ukrainian universities can't afford to subscribe to Western publications. And most Ukrainian academics do not travel to the West to attend conferences, and they don't publish in Western journals. So they're pretty isolated from the sort of Western scholarly world and scholarly community, sadly. At the same time, of course, you have only one center for Ukrainian studies which focuses on the modern era, and that's at the University of Ottawa. But sadly there, it tends to more side with the attacks and the revisionists on Ukrainian nationalism than allowing a broader debate on those issues. The third area is the whole question of politics. The reason why the student numbers are down in Ukrainian studies isn't because Ukrainian studies is a problem. It's because what Ukrainian studies is offering to students. When I arrived in Canada in 2001, I saw the big gap in the lack of teaching on Ukrainian politics. In 2002, I began 2 courses at the University of Toronto, and I taught these through to 2004. I had huge student numbers. In 2004, I continued these similar kinds of courses on Ukrainian politics and on Ukrainian foreign policy at the George Washington University. Again, there I had large student numbers, 20 to 30 students per class in undergraduates, and a graduate class was typically 12 to 15. So student numbers can be found if you're offering the right product. So a lot of it's down to market research. But if you're offering the product which is stale, outdated, hasn't really changed much, hasn't moved with the times, isn't kind of sexy in some ways, then of course the student numbers are going to be down. And that is strange because Ukraine has been in the headlines, particularly in the last 3 years, but not only during the Orange Revolution and earlier. There is a lack of good Ukrainian politics people in the West. Certainly, there's a lack of emphasis and work by Ukrainian studies centers in the field of social media, the media in general. Partly this is generational, with the older generation not even willing to use email, never mind social media. So there's a bit of a Luddite streak in Ukrainian studies. But there isn't this kind of energy you had in the 70s and 80s in Ukrainian studies in North America, where Ukrainian studies centers were involved in trying to thwart and counter the Soviet information war, which then took place. This, for example, was a very well-known leaflet produced back then by the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. I don't know how many, tens of thousands or probably a lot more were distributed. I remember myself distributing them in Great Britain. It was a great leaflet. Where is the contemporary version of such a leaflet? Why are Ukrainian studies today not involved in trying to counter Putin's information war? And to give one example of how this is absent, I ask the viewers of this video blog to do a Google search for Ukraine podcast. Podcasts are becoming extremely popular. People listen to them at the gym, going to work, in the car. It's very easy to do now with Bluetooth and such like. So they're very popular, and they're on a whole range of topics. If you do a search for Podcast Russia, you get huge numbers. Do a search for Podcast Ukraine, you don't get any. The Ukrainian government isn't doing them as part of a counter-PR against Russia's information war, and the Ukrainian diaspora, why isn't Cook doing them? But more importantly, how much effort would it be for CIUS or HURI or other Ukrainian studies centers to do a half-an-hour weekly podcast on topical issues? There's a lot of issues to talk about since 2014, but nobody is doing this. And so it's no wonder, therefore, that there isn't much of a response from either the Ukrainian government or from the Ukrainian diaspora and Ukrainian studies to Putin's information war. And that is clearly seen in the field of academic studies on the crisis in Ukraine, on the war in Ukraine, and is clearly seen in the media environment, what's being discussed. The sort of our position, shall we say, is often ignored from media discussions, from academic discussions of the Ukrainian-Russian war and Russia's military aggression against Ukraine. Therefore, when eventually newer generation academics and others come to take these positions in Canadian and American Ukraine studies centers, there's a lot of potentially new work that can be done in terms of bringing Ukraine studies into the 21st century. At the moment, they're still stuck in time. And therefore, and as long as they are going to be stuck in time, they're going to have low student numbers, and they're not going to have a great influence in the broader academic and scholarly debates, particularly in those three areas I mentioned: Ukrainian-Canadian studies, Ukrainian nationalism, and Ukrainian politics and international relations. Three very important areas where Ukrainian studies really is not doing much. In the case of Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, there we're talking more about American Ukrainian studies as well. But so there's a lot that could be done, and hopefully will be done by the generation of the new people that will come in the next 2, 3, 5 years. Thank you.